fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of Vertical Stars Podcast 4th season. My loyal listeners, thank you for continued support. Enjoy this amazing interview because David F. Walker boards the mothership to discuss Bitter Roots, the next movement from Image Comics. Now, come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. Walker. Thank you for coming to Vertical Stars Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Totally my pleasure. So, I always start off with a question of inspiration. So, inspire your love for comics and who your earliest influences.
Oh man. Well, I'm old, so there's that. And I grew up when both the original animated Spider-Man and then the live action Batman from the 60s
Hmm.
were on in syndication. So I was a little kid. So I grew up with those before I even knew how to read. And then once I discovered that there was books with pictures and words that had these characters in it, it was all over for me. So I was probably like 3, 4 years old when like I got my first comic, which was an issue of Batman, which my nerd cred is always sort of shot because I can never remember the exact number, even though I still have that comic.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that was the beginning. But really early on, I fell in love with the medium of comics, and this was back in the 70s, and uh, uh, they were doing reprints of The Spirit. I believe it was Warren Publishing did these black and white reprints of The Spirit in magazine form. You get on the newsstand. So I was like probably the only 6 or 7 year old kid who was also reading The Spirit along with Batman and the Hulk and all this other stuff, and like was probably the only kid of that age group who was like, I want to be like Will Eisner when I grow up. So there was
Hmm.
that. Will Eisner was a huge influence on me. And some of the other, creators of the 70s, but he was probably the biggest.
So if you were reading Batman in the 70s, we're talking Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams, or
Yeah, I was getting those, and then the first Batman I have, which again I cannot remember the number of it. It's not Denny O'Neil or Neil Adams, but I had a bunch of those issues. And then also like because that the big treasuries would come out, the big
hmm.
treasury editions, and I had a ton of those. Um, I didn't start. Will Eisner was probably the first creator whose name I really started seriously paying attention to. And then there were a handful of others as the 70s progressed. Like if I saw George Perez's name, if George Perez was the artist, like I bought whatever comic
Hmm.
George Perez drew. Um, and then in terms of writers, it seems to me like when I look back, some of my favorite stuff as a writer, I wasn't paying as much attention to the writers as I was the artist. But when I look back on the comics that I really loved as a kid, like Steve Englehart and Steve
Hmm.
Gerber were probably two of the biggest, the writers that I appreciated the most. Um, and then uh, going into late 70s, early 80s, Joe Duffy, because Mary Jo Duffy was writing Power Man and Iron Fist, which was also one of my favorite titles.
That's awesome. And it's really cool to go from a comic book fan to an acclaimed comic book writer. You are the co-writer of Bitterroot,
Mhm.
which the first series was very highly acclaimed. You got very very positive reports on Bitterroot, but it took there was a 4 year gap between the Bitterroot series, and now you created Bitterroot the next movie. So what prompted the return to Bitterroot after that length of time?
The return had actually been in the works for far longer. It took just far longer for us to get our act together. Each one of us, Chuck Brown, Sanford, Greene, myself, all had various different things that we were working on, and so we couldn't get our schedules to line up properly. And I want to say that like so the next movement, which the first issue of that dropped in March, I believe, of this year, March of 2025, but it was done in 2022. It was written in 2022, and a good chunk of this particular arc is 5 issues. Most of it was written in 2023, and then it wasn't until um, like we actually started moving forward and Sanford's schedule freed up, and he was able to start actually working on the art. That then aspects of it were tweaked, and then the last 2 issues, 4 and 5, were written this year.
So when the first series, which I think lasted 15 issues, if memory serves,
Yep.
when the first series ended, you had already in the plans to do the second series, and so that means then there's also plans to do a third series because this is a 5 issue series.
There's so there was we'd always talked about what we would do after we finished that particular arc, the first arc, which covers most of the which covers the 1920s and into the 1930s. And but again, we also knew that I had a bunch of stuff on my plate. Everybody had stuff on their plate. So we're like, okay, let's just sort of take a break. We didn't want to take as long of a break. And now we're sort of in a similar situation where everybody's schedule is just not lining up the way it needs to. And
Mm.
so there's in my mind, there's at least 10 more issues to tell the full story that we're telling, but it was written specifically this arc was specifically written to be 5 issues and to have an end that would like tease the next arc. And I just had a conversation with Sanford like maybe a week ago, 2 weeks ago, and we were talking about, okay, when can we get back into the groove? When can our schedules line up? And I think part of the problem is that we're trying too hard to have all of our schedules working at the same time when in reality we should just have the scripts written, and then when Sanford has the time he can draw them. And but for me it kind of kills the dynamic, that teamwork dynamic that needs to go into a comic. So we're working on figuring it out for sure, but there's always going to be more. I mean, I've got ideas for this. The next movement takes place in 1964. Like I said, I I suspect we've got at least 10 more issues in us for that. But then I also have ideas for a series that takes place in 1982, and then a bunch of other spin-off series and one-shots and things like that for various characters. And so that's sort of what we're talking about. We're talking about how do we expand the series and give characters moments to shine, whether it's a one shot or an annual or like an anthology series in which we do 4 issues, but each issue tells 2 stories of 2 different characters. And there's a lot of options. We just got to figure it out. And we're comic creators, which means our attention spans sometimes are a little off.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that you mentioned 1982. Obviously, 1924 was the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah,
1964, you're talking the prelude to the Civil Rights Act.
yeah.
What was the connection for 1982?
1982 is the hell of the Reagan years, the crack epidemic, the beginning of AIDS, and the early days of hip hop. And so all of those come together. So in a lot of ways, it could be, you know, the hip hop angle, we could push it into the early 70s, or I should say pull it back into the mid 70s or push it to the late 80s. But there's something about 82 to 84 when hip hop was still like being thought of as a fad,
Mm.
and Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five had just dropped the message. Curtis Blow did the breaks. But at the same time, again, the Reagan era was just a terrible time. No matter what anyone tries to tell us, um, we still haven't learned the fact that people are constantly trying to rewrite history. But I just think that that would be a really fascinating time to explore, especially because like all of us, Sanford, Chuck, and myself, were alive back then, and so it's yeah, there's research needed to tell the story, but there's also a lot of coming from our own experiences,
Mhm.
and I so that's what I would like to do. We'll see if we can agree on it.
Well, I think it's also very interesting that the miniseries is being subtitled "The Next Movement," which definitely is, at least far as I know, is a music reference. In music, it's defined as a self-contained section within a symphony
Mhm.
or concerto. Obviously, you're building upon the Harlem Renaissance, which is definitely has connections to music as far as and writing as well, and obviously, but definitely music. As you mentioned, 82 and hip hop. So, can you connect the idea of the importance of music to the Bitterroots I know it's overall series.
Well, yeah, no, it's kind of interesting because music is very important in my life, and it's been very important in the creation of Bitterroot, but it's also like music is pretty difficult to incorporate into your comics, right? Because
Mm,
there's no sound. So, um, I was not in favor of calling this particular arc the next movement. So I was the naysayer in that. But it got to a point where the fight was so ridiculous, I sort of relented. And part of the reason I didn't want to call it the next movement was because I think for a lot of fans and a lot of our fan base, they associate the next movement with the Roots album, with one of the Roots albums, and then that automatically yanks you out of the 1960s and places you into a more contemporary setting. So I was really fighting to stay away from that. Um, but within this story arc, there is, we're trying to work music into it. Um, and in the original 3 volumes, which took place in the 20s, music is also part of it. Um, and if a movie ever gets made, which I don't know at this point, I'm one of those people that's really fighting for, like, let's make sure music is important. Now I don't think I would put up that fight quite as much because Sinners has done a lot of what I would have wanted to do in a Bitter Root movie, if a Bitter Root movie were to be made.
Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a quote that you gave to the Oregon Live page, if you don't mind, and then we'll ask you a
Sure.
question based on it. So this is a quote from that you gave to Oregon Live about the importance of the time period for the 1924 original Bitter Root series. So you've said the Harlem Renaissance is incredibly interesting because it's a time of incredible artistic and cultural growth. At the same time, it was occurring in the midst of an incredibly oppressive and racist era. So what led you to set the miniseries 1964? Do you view the era as one of progression or evidence that even in a moment of great change, the roots of racism still existed and flourished?
It's the answer is that I gave to that related to the original series, I still hold true. I mean, I feel like 1964 was in a lot of ways a very pivotal year in American history and in cultural history, right? Whether you want to call it American culture, Black culture, they're actually one and the same, so it's sort of irrelevant, but not because people make it relevant. But 1964, Malcolm X had not, you know, let's see, when he was Malcolm X was assassinated in 65. So Malcolm X was still alive. The March on Washington had happened just a year before Martin Luther King had given his "I Have a Dream" speech. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham had happened. So many things had happened, but 64 was the beginning of like some pretty significant change with the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and um, and then in 65, 66, you see there's the death of Malcolm X, there's the formation of the Black Panther Party, and and there's this, like, it was like there's a lot of cynicism by 66, 67, and I wanted to make sure that we had a story that took place before all of that really hit, right? And so um and 64 was just an insane year, and that was the year that Goodman, Cheney, and Swarner were murdered in Mississippi, and that's heavily inspired the story that we put together, was the murder of these 3 civil rights workers. And so 64 just seemed um like it's almost like this weird limbo of the civil rights movement, where which direction is it going to go? If we look at the, like, 61, 62, 63, there's this level of fear, anxiety, but optimism. And then by 66, 67, 68, it's just a lot of dread and feeling of defeat. Like, 68 is when Martin Luther King was killed. Malcolm X was killed before him. Medgar was killed before him. And there was so much, like, the dark times were really starting to set in. 67 was the year of the long hot summer, which was, you know, months and months of racial violence throughout America. And it just felt like 64 was we were about to hit the breaking point, or the tipping point, which I think is also a title of a Roots album, if I remember correctly.
I think it's fascinating. And I think it's also interesting. For the readers that don't know, the primary threat in the series, and if I get the names wrong, please just correct me, okay?
Yeah,
Am I saying it
Genu,
correctly?
yep.
Jinnu. The Jinnu are basically, from my understanding, are allegories for racism and hatred. That's why they're basically humans can turn into these monsters through this fear and hatred and whatnot. But you do say in the Bitter Roots comic book, I can't remember if it's issue one or issue three, that the Jinnu now are a different type of Jinnu in 1964. So kind of follow through that allegory a little bit.
Yeah, so the Jinnu are they're people whose essentially their souls have been infected and by the racism and the hatred that they feel, and it turns them into monsters, and then those monsters act. And so in 64, what's happening in the next movement is we're seeing an evolution of that hatred, right? Which like is what we were seeing in the 1960s, and we're seeing it again right now. We're seeing it in 2025. 60 years, a little over 60 years later. But the early 60s was the time of desegregation, and that was one of those periods of time when we saw America at its ugliest. And the things that um you know anti-desegregation, or we should just say segregationists, they would not stop at anything. They
Hmm.
murdered children, right? And in some cases got away with it, right? And now we see a very similar thing going on now. We don't necessarily see We're not seeing the level of murder that was going on, but we're also seeing a lot of state sanctioned violence towards people. And so that hatred and that intolerance that has kept America from being the great country that it can be has always been here, and it always continues to evolve with each generation. They find different ways to talk about it, they find different ways to mask it, but they still bring it, and they will bring it down hard on people who oppose them. And in my belief, that they bring it down hard on people who are on the right side of history.
Hmm. Now, when you're thinking about, 'cause it's just word you use is masking. I do feel like, let's say, going back to 2016, definitely there's also connections to Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. When you talk, I feel like racism is now something that is more, in certain areas, readily acceptable in the open air, as it were. Do you feel like 64 and let's say 2016 and those years, it was more culturally acceptable in certain areas versus in between where it was quietly masked more, but kind of simmered, or would you say it's been pretty much consistent throughout?
I think it's been consistent throughout. It's just been like a lot of it is where the media turns its cameras, and how
Hmm.
the media looks at things. There's always going to be a group of people or groups of people that the society at large will blame for its ills.
Hmm.
Um, in the early 2000s, it was Muslims. After 9/11, Muslims were the biggest threat to America, right? And then now it's immigrants, and it's people whose gender does not follow the two gender binary. And the thing is that what people need to understand is that tomorrow there'll be somebody else. There's
Hmm.
always going to be somebody else that some people blame for our problems. And it's yeah, I guess it's easier for some people to point a finger in another direction than to look at themselves. So um I think it's an evolution of um how we see it, how it's presented to us by the media, how we learn about it. Whether it's in schools, which all of that is being taken away from us right now. So
Hmm.
so now it's like I literally have people telling me, "Oh, I'm learning about stuff through Bitterroot that I've never learned in school. How come I didn't learn this in school?" And it's like, I could hazard a guess, but I can tell you why you're learning it in Bitterroot, and that's because myself and Sanford and Chuck and John Jennings, who curates all of our back matter, we think it's important.
Hmm. I think it's another interesting aspect or an allegory to Bitterroot of the next movement. And again, if I say the name wrong, please correct me. This Sandries family.
The Sangrier family.
Sandre, I'm gonna get that wrong multiple times, so feel free to correct me every
Okay.
single time. Sandre family. One of the important aspects of the family is, at least from a philosophical standpoint towards the Jinnu, is that they believe it's more important to heal them than destroy them, which is not true of every character in the book, but it's important to them. So when you're thinking about dealing with hatred, which is let's say, obviously real world as well as the fictional world, why do you think it's more important to try to heal the wounds created by racism than destroy those who are, I guess, acting out on the racism?
Well, a lot of this comes from my own personal philosophies, right? But when the people who are the oppressors, the racists, the people who are, in favor of going into schools and yanking out children because they're immigrants, um, in order to do that, you have to dehumanize people, right? And the whole history of enslaved Africans and their descendants has been the history of the practice of dehumanization, right? Dehumanization, and it doesn't just happen to Black folks; it happens to women, although a lot of women don't recognize the fact that they're being dehumanized. But the truth of the matter is that the moment somebody makes a decision to dehumanize another, they've dehumanized themselves. They've given up the right to call themselves true human beings. And and so the question of, do you help try to cure these people or do you fight them? You don't fight, you're not supposed to fight fire with fire, right? It's
Mm,
um you don't fight hate with hate. You've got to find another way to turn it around. And I think that the what a lot of people don't understand is that part of the difficulty of the struggle of the oppressed in the as they're trying to reclaim and or stake claim to their humanity, they have to help their oppressor reach their humanity too. And that's it. So it's like double, and the oppressor doesn't think they've given up their humanity, right? But when you tie a bunch of sticks of dynamite together and you blow up a church, and four little girls are killed in the process because you and your friends don't think segregation is a good thing, you are not a human being. when
mm,
you when you um when you drag a Black man out of his house in front of his kids, you castrate him, you hang him from a tree, you burn him alive, and then you take pictures of it and turn it into postcards, which is historically what happened. There was a huge industry of lynching postcards. You've given up all humanity. When you tell a woman that she doesn't have a right over her body, that it should be legislated based on whatever beliefs you may have, religious beliefs you may have that may differ from mine, you've given up your humanity. And so the struggle of the oppressed, I believe, has always been twofold. It's both to claim their humanity, but it's also to heal these really sick fuckers who like want to kill you, who want to destroy you. And like that's not an easy place to be in.
Now, from both the point of view of the story and the Jinnu, and obviously the allegory of the people who represent the Jinnu, does every individual want to be healed deep down? And is every individual capable of being healed then?
Oh, I believe most people, I believe a lot of people don't think they need to be healed. And I do think that there's some people that are incapable of being healed. If the healing of these damaged souls was I won't say easy, but and I do think it's possible and it does happen, but I don't think we like as a society we'd be in the situation we're in if healing was that easy. I mean, somewhere along the line, something really went wrong with this country.
Mm,
And maybe it's always been this wrong. Maybe it's just me looking at it through some semblance of rose-colored glasses, but like it does seem worse now than it was, say, 30, 40 years ago. And if that's the case, then it means that a lot of my generation, Gen X, hasn't done what they were supposed to do, right?
mm,
Like we were the ones that were supposed to save everything. We were the ones during the Reagan era, the young kids listening to punk rock and hip hop and good metal, because not all metal is good, but some of the good metal, um, like what went wrong? Like how did we lose control this much?
mm,
Um, and the fact of the matter is that I suspect, the predators know how to lie in wait, right?
mm,
You watch videos from National Geographic, An alligator will be very still as it's waiting to strike. A lion will be very,
Mm,
and the people that we're talking about are predators, right? And they're willing to wait. And now they've gotten a taste of blood, and now it's like a feeding frenzy of hatred. I
mm.
There's part of me that the older I get that I start to think, oh yeah, nope, it's been like this all along. There's just a lot of good people, or a lot of people that were very good at masking it, or a lot of people that were waiting for an excuse um to become, I guess, drunk with the perception of power that they have.
Now, I'm going to throw out another allegory. So if I'm incorrect, please, or what do you, if you think it's wrong of an allegory, let me know. I wonder, do you think racist or racism is a little bit okay, for the example, let's when an animal is dying, okay, they tend to
Mhm.
rally at the very end, the
Yeah.
last got gasp of their energy before it happens. Do you feel is there possible on some level that racism is that rally where they started dying off and now there's like a gasp of trying to grab the power one last time, maybe? Because I kind of feel like and I kind of fun. I had a conversation with my father about this a little bit. The idea that when, like, say, Barack Obama like won his presidency, it freaked the shit out of a whole lot of very racist individuals that things have turned that
Yeah.
much to on the other side. That it's like this final gasp of trying to get that power back.
I think there's a lot of validity to that. I think there's more to it than that. It's not just the power, it's also I think to a certain extent identity, right?
Mm,
And um if you really study history, you understand that history is taught in an overly simplified way, and that history is also taught with a lot of half truths or untruths. Um and and so I think it's this realization of, like, when people say, make America great again, I have to ask, well, what do you mean by that? Like, I
mm,
want specifics. I want you to give me 10 specifics of what you mean by making it great again. And
right.
not anything abstract. Tell me what it is. Because what you're really saying is, like, you know, this country was like, it was segregated. It didn't become desegregated till about 60 years ago. So if
Right.
you're talking about making things great again, you're talking about segregation. You're talking about voting rights. You're talking about, like all the things. This is all code for something, right? Um, but it's not also about power. It's about, you know, we're taught that Christopher Columbus was a great man who discovered America,
Mm,
and that's a big lie, right? And if your own identity is tied into a lot of these lies, it's not power so much that you're afraid of losing. You're afraid of losing your identity. You're
mm,
afraid of losing that thing that you think makes you special. And that thing that a lot of people think makes them special are the tenets of white supremacy, which, when you study the history of the colonization of the Americas and the history of slavery, it was all built on these principles that certain people from Europe, certain white people from Europe, were superior to others. And it's crazy because there was a time, and this is a double-edged sword to use this argument, but there was a time when the Irish weren't considered, white. There was a time when the Italians weren't considered white. There was a time when Jews weren't considered white. Catholics weren't considered white. All these, but the double-edged sword of that is, at some point they all became white, right?
mm,
The like, the color of skin has always been the easiest way to separate people.
mm,
And that's why the colonies went from slavery and indentured servitude to just straight slavery. It
mm,
was it was as simple as that, because it was easy to take those white indentured servants from Europe, give them their freedom by giving them jobs to police over the black folks who were enslaved for life. And then suddenly you had this mentality of, like, oh, as bad as my life might be as a poor white person, at least I'm not like them.
mm,
And that's, like, so much of America is built on this idea of people who were able to say, at least I'm not like them. And
mm.
everybody does it. right? Everybody has, no matter where you are on the socioeconomic ladder, you could be at the very bottom rung, and there's always going to be someone that you can look at and go, at least I'm not like them,
Mm,
right? I got it better. I got a cardboard box to live in, and this guy's sleeping in the gutter, right?
mm.
And suddenly that's privilege. And with privilege comes a sense of can, not always, but can come a sense of superiority and a sense of power over others.
Now, I'm a teacher during the day, and I teach seventh grade, and we're reading an interesting book with the students called Pet, which is a really interesting book about, and one of the tenets of the book is that in this world, that is an allegory as well for a lot of different negative, like race and a bunch of other things. It's a very interesting book. The idea is that these people who live in Lucille want to forget or deny that in the world is monsters still exist, right?
Hmm.
In Bitterroot Next Movement, you have a character named Agent Steel who also denies that Jinnu still can exist anymore. According to him, it's done, they finished it, it's over. So why does he need to believe that's true, and why do people need to believe that, or some people need to believe that the problems of the past, race and things of that nature, are over. We beat racism somehow, and now and are very much part of their character is being not proven wrong about it. They have to believe that they passed it already, and they don't have to worry about it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I can, it's easier to answer that question as it relates to Agent Steel more than it does to real people. But I think that there's you hear this a lot when just in everyday discourse or debates over race, racism, all this sort of stuff, when people will say, well, my family didn't own slaves,
Hmm.
so why am I being made accountable? My family, we're not from the South, so we didn't, we didn't support segregation. And the bigger answer is, well, what did your family do to
Hmm.
stop segregation? And the reality is that America as a whole, the wealth of America, the power of America was built on a largely, free labor source. So it didn't matter that northern states didn't have massive plantations with slaves.
Hmm.
Like, the whole country benefited from it, right? Um, and that's it's interesting to see that, you know, this division amongst different states and regions that we see now, these ideological splits are no different than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago. And you know, like, some people like to live a lie, right? And losers, cowards and traitors love to live a lie, right? And I'll say this for a fact: the Confederates lost the war. They were cowards and they were traitors to this country. And one of the first things they did after they lost the Civil War was they rewrote their own history,
Hmm.
and then they managed to push that agenda. The Daughters of the Confederacy, all these other organizations that came around during Reconstruction, that pushed the agenda of that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. Okay. Now, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but I've read every single article of secession from all the Confederate states, and all of them, every single one of them, said the same reason: we're fighting to keep our slaves. We're not fighting for states' rights. We're fighting for states' rights to keep slaves. Um, Most people don't want to admit that their forefathers and foremothers were scum, which they were, right? Maybe they were nice people, right? I mean, you can be a nice person and be a scumbag at the same time. It does happen, right? Um, but I think it's this inability to own the truth, and most people want to believe a lie that makes them feel comfortable than a truth that makes them feel uncomfortable. And that's Agent Steel to a T. Agent Steel, to me, when we came up with him as a character, was like, um, that person who wants to believe lies because the lies make him feel better, right?
Hmm.
And in the case of Bitterroot, the lie that's being told is that these monsters don't exist anymore. And these monsters, in the case of Bitterroot, the Jinnu, and in the case of Steel, his there's probably monsters like that in his family. He might
Mm.
be a monster like that for all we know. If under the right set of circumstances, that that monstrosity might manifest. And so to me, it's like, because we all do it. We in one form or another, there comes a point where there's a lie that the vast majority of us want to believe so bad that we accept it as the truth, even though deep down inside a lot of us might suspect it's a lie, right? It doesn't always have to do with race or racism or sex or sexism, but it's that, you know, there's it's amazing what people who don't feel good about themselves will do to feel good about themselves. And it seems like for some people the easiest way is to turn someone else into a victim.
Now, from the perspective of Agent Steele, obviously, as we said, he's a denier of genius that still exist. However, he's still working on some level to stop something, or at least investigate what
Yeah.
happened with those murders. Does that suggest that there's potential for him to realize truth of things and act on it, or is he more likely to, not the right word, implode, but pull inward when he realizes that everything he believed now is false?
You're just gonna have to wait to read the comic to find that out. That's you're getting into spoiler territory there. Um, I'll just say this. I'll just say that Agent Steel is there. Every character that we've introduced that's in some in any capacity in the next movement, every single one of them is going to go through something that forces them to rethink what they hold true. Doesn't mean they're going to move away from what they hold to be true, but they're going to have to do some self-examination. And that includes the members of the Sangrier family, as well as Steele and everybody else that we meet.
Now, a very interesting character as well is Dr. Sylvester.
Yep.
He refers to his immortality as a curse,
Hmm.
but also that he's God's chosen warrior. So, interestingly enough, he's both existing as a curse and a chosen of
Hmm.
by the same being. The same being that chose him as some sort of hero is also the same one that cursed him. So, can you kind of break down the idea of the existing as both as a curse and I guess blessed? I guess chosen that you have to assume is the same idea as blessed. So he's both cursed and blessed at the same time. Can you kind of break
Yeah,
that
no,
idea down?
it's a very interesting dynamic. And this now we're going to get into sort of how the creative process works. We knew that we were going to bring Dr. Sylvester back, that he would be one of the main characters from the earlier series that was going to come back. But we also decided that um, he won't have aged. There'll be something, and that's all we knew. And and I kept saying, well, we're going to have to figure out why he hasn't aged at some point, right? Um, but let's run with it, right? And so we see him and he's covered in scars. So we know that for the last 40 years or so, he's been fighting some serious fights and he's lived through some serious battles. Um, but as we were working on it, we couldn't come up with um, why he was seemingly immortal. And so I did something that I do that some people will think is really weird, is I sat down and I had a conversation with Dr. Sylvester because he is a very well-formed character, I feel. I understand him. So I just sort of sat at the computer and I said, oh, I was like, okay, why, what's going on here? Why are you still alive? Why are you still fighting this fight? Why haven't you aged? And I went back and I read all the issues that we'd written in the past, and I was looking at him and I saw here was this man of incredible faith who his faith was tested all along, right? He lost his, spoiler alert for people who haven't read the first three volumes, he lost his wife to cancer, then he lost his children in the Tulsa race massacre, and then he's saved by this woman, Eliza Nightsdale, and then he loses her, and during all of this, he's overcome with so much sorrow and anger and hatred that he himself transforms into a monster. And then, but then he meets the Sangrier family and they meet as enemies, but then they come together as allies. And he's been through all of this stuff. And in some ways, he represents to me those people who have have the ability to see the bigger picture, um, and but they're lost within themselves. And that was him. And we talked about that. Him and we talked about that. And and I, and it's crazy because I was just sort of typing this stream of consciousness notes of what Dr. Sylvester would say, what I think he would say as a character that I co-created. And then I realized, like, oh, he's gonna think he's God picked him, and he's gonna think that God picked him is more of a curse than a blessing. But he also understands he's not going to shy away from that responsibility. And that's how the whole thing came about. And it came about very, very recently. Like, we had started this new arc, and it wasn't until issue 3, um, where Shelley Bond, our editor, was really pushing for, like, what is going on with him? What is happening? How is he? Why hasn't he aged? Why this? Why that? And the issue was drawn. Issue 3 was drawn, and I still didn't have it. But as I was looking at the art, I knew that, like, now is the time. Like, issue 3 is the midway point. We're only gonna have 2 issues after this, and we need to at least let the reader know what's going on inside this guy's mind. And so that I pushed really hard to break through to the other side. Now it's a question of figuring out, is this really what's going on with him? But we don't have to resolve that in this particular arc, thankfully.
Now, it's interesting enough, if let's say with going the idea, and his view that God chose him to be immortal to fight these jinn, these monsters. Okay, um, the fact that he's immortal to fight monsters suggests very much that monsters are also immortal, such as they are going to exist. Evil's going to exist forever.
Yeah,
What is also does that suggest that these no matter what he does, the evil that he's going to face is indefeatable as far as there's never going to be an end to it. 100 years from now, he's still going to be dealing with monsters of some sort, one way or another. It is, I mean, what does that say about your life as a fighter of evil? That it's never going to be. I think there's even a line for Batman in the comics, like evil endures forever, basically.
yeah.
What does that say about your test? That no matter what you do, it's never going to be over.
It's a good question. We're gonna have to ask him in whatever the next arc comes along. I think that's the part of what my philosophy is with comics, and not just comics, but with film and literature and TV, is that not every question has to be answered. It's great to ask the questions, and maybe I have an answer. Maybe I have a response to your question, but it's not necessarily my place to give it, because the final contributor to the comic is the reader, and the reader has to make their own decisions, has to make up their own minds. I'm working on a project right now that I'm just in the early stages of, and I was talking to some friends about, and I was like, there's a character here who, um like, is potentially really, really evil, or maybe they're just really broken. And what's the difference? And how far do I push it? And what sort of direction do I lead the reader in? And what conclusion do I want them to come up with? And sometimes the answer is, I want them, for me as a creator, the answer is, I want them to come up with the answer that works best for them, right?
Mm.
And so, um I think that, with Dr. Sylvester, and where his fate is going to take him, and is he really immortal or not? Um, you know, Hopefully we'll get to explore that some more, but I also feel like sometimes it's best to have, um questions that remain unanswered, right? And in that, I mean, I don't prefer a story that ends with happily ever after. And I don't necessarily love a story that ends with, like, this dark, this dark doom. I think of the end of Easy Rider, right? With Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper. Like, it's the antithesis of happily ever after, but it's an ending. That
Yeah.
story ends there. Whereas, you know, there's John Carpenter's The Thing, which has a pretty dark and grim ending, but it's still like there it's still open-ended. And I kind of like that open-ended nature. I think that for me as a young person, that sparked my imagination more than movies or comics that I read that had a finite ending, that had moments that you could ask, oh, like, well, wait a sec, what's going on, right? Like,
Mm,
I was a kid when the first Star Wars movie came out, and there was no talk like in my world. I'm like 8 years old or however old I was when it came out. I didn't know there was going to be a sequel. I just knew that they blew up the Death Star and we didn't see Darth Vader die. And I was like, oh man. And me and my cousin were writing our own stories about what happens to Darth Vader, right? Like it's in some of those open-ended stories that our creativity is ignited and is born.
mm,
And so I think as someone who's fortunate enough to be working in a creative industry and not necessarily making a living off of it, but making some money off of it, part of me feels obligated to, like, yeah, I want to inspire some of you to write your own
mm,
stories and come up with your own meaning. Um, there's we don't need to be preached to. We just need to be inspired, right?
mm. I think it's kind of interesting, and I do bring up the idea you talk about like evil, and especially broken versus evil. I always think like evil, the difference between evil and maybe something that's just bad. That evil knows it's evil necessarily, but doesn't care for what it's doing. Do the Jinnu know or define themselves as being bad, or do or the Jinnu view themselves as being um as the hero's story is their hero of their own story, as it were?
I think they're the hero of their own story. I do think that. I mean, I think that there's probably some Genu out there who are like, oh, wait a sec, I didn't mean to be this bad, like, um, but it's like there's most bad people, or most people who do bad things, they don't think of themselves as the villain, right? I mean, the reality is, in my view, the villains are running the country right now. They all think they're the heroes.
Mm,
And no matter what I sit down and say to them, no matter how intelligent the discourse might be, I doubt I could convince any of them otherwise,
mm,
that hey, you're kind of scum, you know. And it's interesting. I mean, it's we have this, when we talk about the police, and there's always the debate over, the good cops versus the bad cops, and they say, people say, well, most cops are good. They're good. There's only a few bad apples, and it's like, yeah, but it only takes one bad apple to ruin everything. I mean,
mm,
I used to be a teacher, and I taught at Portland State University for many years, and I would say, yeah, it only takes one really bad student to ruin it for the entire class, right?
mm,
And I was like, and sometimes you get stuck with three or four of them. And if you get stuck with three or four bad students, and I don't care, like, I'm not going to be one of those people that are like, oh, there's no bad people. It's like, no, there's some people who do bad things, right? And so then it becomes a question of, okay, how can I control this classroom environment so that the other, 30 some odd students that are trying to take this seriously get something out of it, as opposed to these four that are disrupting it, right? And
mm,
the four that are disrupting it think, oh, I'm funny, or they think, oh, I'm more interesting than the professor. And it's like, you might be funny and you might be more interesting than me, but nobody's here for that. And this has its time and place. And so, um, I mean, I know people who are, like, I used to work for this guy, this was years ago, who was a former grand wizard in the Ku Klux Klan, right? And I worked for him. I didn't know at the time, and he was no longer in the Klan. But I worked for him. I knew his family. And if you had, he wasn't a friend, he was my boss. Um, but if you had told me, like, I was shocked when I found out that he was in the Klan, right? I mean, I've known some really morally suspect people who, um they're not morally suspect all the time, right?
mm,
Ted Bundy wasn't morally suspect every single moment of his life, but he was still a horrific killer who had a bunch of girlfriends and people who really liked him. We're very we all can be more complex than we give ourselves credit for, and um and a lot of us tend to think in very absolute binary terms, black and white, good and evil, right and wrong, and it's way more complex than that.
Hmm. And another interesting, as you mentioned earlier, it made the news, honestly, that there was talk of a Bitterroot film from Legendary Pictures. Are you able to give us a status update on that?
Yeah, there's not much other than to say that Legendary won't be making the movie. We're no longer that option has expired, and we were not interested in renewing it for a variety of reasons. And but we're still talking to people in Hollywood, and there's more interest now than there was, say, 2 months ago. This is the success of Sinners really bolstered the interest in Bitterroot, and the fact that Coogler doesn't want to do sequels to Sinners has made I think the interest in Bitterroot that much more
Hmm.
um, intense. And so we're talking about it, but it's a lot of it's learned a lot of lessons from the experience at Legendary, and Hollywood is a very fickle and odd place. I mean, there are projects that have been in development for 30 plus years that are like how did this take that long, right? How did it
Hmm.
take you look at how long it took between from the Batman 1966 television series to Tim Burton's Batman movie was 23 years. 23 years it took somebody to make a Batman movie. And then when you hear about all the ideas that they had, well, most of them were going to suck, right? Jim Cameron's Spider-Man movie was not going to be good, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm in no hurry to see a bad Bitterroot movie made. Um, and and that's the thing. There's a lot of people who think they know better than we do. And and what's always interesting whenever I have conversations, especially myself, because I tend to have some of the conversations with the Hollywood people more. It's like, yeah, don't ever get it twisted. There's a reason I don't work in film, and it
Hmm.
has nothing to do with my not being good enough to do it. It's like I just don't want to work. I don't want to be down in LA. I don't want to do. There's a lot of things I don't want to do, but I know this story better. There's only two people that might know the story better than me, and that's Chuck and that's Sanford. um and once in a while you'll see a film that comes along that's based on existing material, existing intellectual properties, that like actually takes it to another level, and that's always great. I mean, I believe Across the Spider-Verse, oh no, not Across, Into the Spider-Verse, the first one, although Across was an amazing movie, but Into the Spider-Verse, I honestly felt took Spider-Man and Miles Morales specifically to a whole other level. And you know, and I've had this. I sat in a movie theater with Brian Michael Bendis watching Into the Spider-Verse for the first time, and even he was like, "Ooh, wow, they did some stuff I never would have thought of." And so as a creator, once your property, if you have a property that's adapted into another medium, you want to see them take it to another level. You don't want to see them dumb it down, which is, but look, nobody ever talks about the Jonah Hex movie for a reason,
Hmm.
right? Nobody talks about the Nick Fury made for TV movie for a reason, right? There's so many things we don't talk about. We talk about Howard the Duck like it's the crowning achievement in horrible adaptations, and it's not. It's not even the worst, right?
Yeah.
So um I just think that when it comes to film or TV or adaptations, that like you want to get people who respect the material enough, um and then we as the originators of that material have to not be afraid to um we have to find trust. But there were some conversations over Bitterroot where I was like, oh no, that's just a dumb idea. Like why are you doing it this way? Like, you can't figure it out. Okay, then you shouldn't be working on this. Like, if you
Hmm.
can't figure it out. And that was honestly, I think that was part of the problem with Legendary. And it's I'm sure that there are uh other like I had a property years ago. It was a comic that I co-created called Number 13. It was over at Dark Horse, and there was a lot of interest in Hollywood. And um, there's a character in it, and she was like this weird mutant who was like half snake, half woman, right? She looked a lot like the Medusa in the original Clash of the Titans movie, right? And we're sitting in these meetings where executives were saying, well, we don't understand how this person can be half woman, half snake. Did she have sex with a snake? And it was like, in my mind, that was the moment it was over. I was like, okay, she's a monster. Like, why do I have to have an explanation for her being a monster this way? And why do you want the script to address this? And what kind of perverted nonsense is running around in your mind that you want the answers to those questions? And the reality is there was a time when, we'll call them superhero movies more than just comic book movies, where superhero movies they had to be an origin story, right? You had to see Peter Parker get bit by the spider and Uncle Ben get killed, or you had to see Bruce Wayne's parents get killed, or you had to see Superman rocketing from, Krypton as a baby. And we're just now barely breaking out of that origin story mode, right?
Hmm.
And, I'm, I won't say I have high hopes for James Gunn's new Superman movie, but there's a lot to be said for like, it doesn't look like an origin story to me,
Hmm.
right? Um, and the audience at this point is sophisticated enough. Now, notice I said sophisticated enough, not sophisticated, period, right? But they're sophisticated enough that they accept people in crazy costumes running around doing superheroic things. And whenever someone in Hollywood says, well, we need to totally explain everything why, it's like, well, no, you're not giving your audience enough credit, right?
Hmm.
And that's again, that's why I love Sinners. I think Sinners is an amazing movie, and I've watched it 3 times and pre-ordered the Blu-ray. And but the one of the things I love about that movie is like there's the world that happened before the movie started, and then there's the world that's going to keep going after the movie's over. And
Hmm.
that's great. Like I don't need to see the smokestack twins before they left, Mississippi. I just need to know that they left and they came back, and they came back because life outside of Mississippi, life up in Chicago wasn't what they'd hoped it would be. And you get little bits and pieces of it. I mean, to me, that's a master class in writing and storytelling. Um, and there's just enough spelled out and explained that for the most part we know what's going on. Whereas other filmmakers or studios would have wanted to see all of it and or to tell it all. You don't need all of that. So
Hmm.
I hope Bitterroot, I do hope it gets made as a movie. But I also hope that gets made as something that doesn't completely suck. I've seen enough stuff that completely sucks. I've seen my friends' works, they're adapted poorly. I've had my own work adapted poorly, and so it's like, yep, I like, if you're gonna do it really bad, let's just not do it at all,
Hmm.
because that shit keeps me up at night.
So for the listeners, what can we look forward to in the upcoming issues of Bitterroot, the next movement?
That's a good question. So number 3 just came out. So what we're gonna see is, um, they're going to the family. Everybody is going to face a monster the likes of which they've never seen, which really sort of opens up where the story can go once the team gets its act together and takes the story in other places. So but we're also going to see issue 4, which comes out in about 2 weeks, I think, 2 to 3 weeks. Um, is going to be the first issue that really bridges a lot of the gaps between the generations, right?
Hmm.
And so you're going to get some glimpses and hints at what's happened between, I think, because the last time we saw the family together was the late 30s, and now it's 1964. So we're going to see some glimpses. We're going to get a better idea of what Dr. Sylvester's role is within him as a member of this extended family. Um, and there's I think there's some heartbreak. I think there might be some tears shed. Um, and hopefully some surprises too. I think there's a huge surprise coming in issue number 4. And there's only one person I've talked to who's kind of figured it out. So we'll see. But issue 4 is the one I'm waiting for. Shelley Bond, our editor, who I love, she's great. She has been like, all she says is this is the best issue of Bitterroot of all the issues we've done so far is number 4. So we'll see. I hope that the readers agree.
That sounds awesome. Mr. Walker, thank you so much for coming on the show. Please come back, especially with the new project you said you're working on to talk about it. It's been an absolute pleasure, sir.
Thank you. I'll come back for sure.
Have a great night.
Yeah, take care.